Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness leave the deepest marks on history. There's something profound about helping strangers in their darkest hour, especially when you expect nothing in return. When giant Viking warrior Einar found two elderly people freezing in a snowstorm, he brought them home and saved their lives. He thought it was just the right thing to do. 3 days later, 200 armed warriors arrived at his door. They came to kneel, not to fight. The old couple he rescued were actually lost rulers of an ancient clan. His act of mercy had awakened a forgotten oath that would change his life forever. Einar now faced an impossible choice: accept leadership of these warriors or let an ancient legacy die with him. Would this simple act of compassion lead to his greatest triumph or his ultimate downfall? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had been howling across the fjords for 3 days now, carrying with it the bitter promise of the harshest winter in living memory. Einar the Broadshield stood at the edge of his long hall's great hearth, watching the flames dance against the stone walls that had sheltered his family for generations. At 47 winters, he had earned his name not just for the massive oak and iron shield that hung above the mantle, but for the broad shoulders that had carried the weight of countless battles and even heavier burdens. His weathered hands traced the intricate carvings on the hearth's edge, wolves running beneath a crescent moon, etched by his grandfather's own blade decades before Einar's birth. The long hall itself spoke of a different time, when warriors like him were more common, when the old ways still held sway over these remote northern lands. Thick timber beams stretched overhead, darkened by generations of smoke and stories, while tapestries woven by his late wife Astrid still adorned the walls, their colours muted, but their beauty enduring. The hall could easily house 50 warriors, but for the past 3 years it had been home to only one. Einar's children had grown and scattered like seeds on the wind. His eldest son Magnus now served a jarl 2 fjords south, while his daughter Sigrid had married a blacksmith in the coastal settlements. They visited when the seasons allowed, bringing grandchildren who filled the ancient walls with laughter that echoed long after their departure. Tonight, however, the hall felt particularly empty. The storm outside had driven even the hardiest travellers to seek shelter elsewhere, leaving Einar alone with his thoughts and the ever-present weight of solitude that had settled upon him since Astrid's passing. She had been the heart of this place, the one who could fill any silence with warmth and wisdom. Without her gentle presence, the long hall felt more like a monument to the past than a home for the present. He moved to the great table where he took his meals, running his palm across wood worn smooth by countless gatherings. This was where treaties had been signed, where disputes had been settled, where marriages had been arranged and alliances forged. His father, Thorvald the Bold, had ruled from this very spot, dispensing justice with the same measured consideration that Einar now brought to his own decisions. The leadership had passed to him not through conquest, but through respect, something rarer and more valuable than gold in these harsh lands. Einar's reputation extended far beyond the boundaries of his own territory. Other jarls sought his counsel in matters of war and peace alike, knowing that his word carried the weight of honor and his judgment remained unclouded by personal ambition. He had never sought to expand his holdings through force, preferring instead to maintain the delicate balance that kept the fjords peaceful. This restraint had earned him enemies among the more aggressive chieftains, but it had also secured him allies who valued stability over conquest. The sound of wind rattling the shutters drew his attention to the narrow windows that looked out upon the frozen landscape. Snow had been falling steadily for hours, transforming the familiar contours of his land into an alien wilderness of white and shadow. The river that normally provided fresh water and a route for trade goods had frozen solid weeks ago, its surface now buried beneath layers of ice and snow that would not yield until spring's arrival. His daily routines had adapted to winter's demands. Each morning brought the same careful ritual, checking the livestock in their reinforced shelters, ensuring adequate stores of firewood remained accessible and maintaining the pathways between the various buildings that comprised his holding. The work kept his body strong and his mind focused, but it also served as a reminder of how precarious life could become when nature unleashed its full fury. Einar walked to the great chest where he kept his father's weapons and armor, lifting the lid to reveal the carefully maintained steel within. His own sword, Frostbite, lay beside the older blades, a weapon that had tasted blood in defense of his people, but had never been drawn in anger or greed. The blade bore nicks and scratches that told stories of desperate fights and hard-won victories, each mark a reminder of battles fought not for glory, but for survival and protection. The storm intensified as evening deepened, and Einar found himself thinking about the stories his grandmother used to tell during nights like these. She had spoken of the old gods and their involvement in mortal affairs, of how acts of kindness and cruelty alike could echo through generations, shaping destinies in ways that mortals could never fully comprehend. As a boy, he had dismissed such tales as the fantasies of an aging mind. Now, with the wisdom that comes from living long enough to see patterns emerge and repeat, he wondered if perhaps the old woman had possessed insights that his younger self had been too foolish to appreciate. The fire crackled and sparked, sending shadows dancing across the walls in patterns that seemed almost alive. Einar settled into his great chair, a massive piece of carved oak that had been his father's throne and his grandfather's before that. The worn armrests bore the impressions of countless hands, and the high back was adorned with the family symbol, a great bear standing beneath the northern stars. Sitting here, surrounded by the accumulated history of his lineage, he felt the full weight of responsibility that came with being the last of his particular line. His marriage to Astrid had been arranged by their fathers, but it had blossomed into something rare and beautiful, a partnership built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared values. She had understood the loneliness that came with leadership, the burden of making decisions that affected not just their immediate family, but the hundreds of souls who looked to him for protection and guidance. Her counsel had been invaluable during the difficult years when neighboring jarls had pressed him to join their raiding expeditions or territorial expansion. The absence of her wisdom now felt like a physical ache. How many times had he wished for her gentle voice, cutting through his doubts, offering the perspective that only comes from someone who knows you better than you know yourself. The decisions seemed harder now, the consequences more uncertain. Perhaps that was simply the natural result of aging, or perhaps it was the recognition that some burdens were never meant to be carried alone. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the landscape. Einar could hear the wind testing every joint and seam of the Longhall's construction, probing for weaknesses like an enemy seeking entrance. The building had withstood countless such storms over the generations, its foundation deeply rooted in both stone and tradition. Still, each winter brought new challenges, and each year the maintenance grew more demanding. Tomorrow, if the weather permitted, he would need to check the outlying buildings and ensure that his few remaining servants had adequate supplies. Old Henrik, who tended the livestock, lived in a smaller dwelling near the animal shelters. Margit, the cook who had served his family for 20 years, maintained quarters adjacent to the main kitchen. These people depended on him not just for employment, but for protection against the harsh realities of northern winters. The responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders as he contemplated the challenges that lay ahead. Food stores, while adequate, required careful management to last until spring's arrival brought new opportunities for hunting and trade. The livestock needed constant attention to prevent disease and ensure their survival through the coldest months. Most importantly, the delicate network of relationships with neighboring settlements required ongoing maintenance through visits and correspondence that became increasingly difficult as winter deepened. As the night advanced and the storm showed no signs of abating, Einar found himself reflecting on the choices that had brought him to this moment. He could have pursued conquest like so many of his contemporaries, expanding his territory through force and intimidation. He could have sought marriage alliances that would have increased his political influence and material wealth. Instead, he had chosen a different path, one that emphasized protection over predation, wisdom over warrior's pride. That choice had cost him opportunities for greater power and recognition among the more aggressive Jarls, but it had also preserved something valuable that many of his peers had lost: the respect and genuine loyalty of his people. They followed him not out of fear but out of trust, knowing that his decisions were made with their welfare in mind rather than his own glorification. The fire burned low as midnight approached, casting longer shadows and creating an atmosphere of contemplation that seemed appropriate for such a night. Einar rose from his chair and added fresh logs to the flames, watching as they caught and flared, driving back the darkness once more. The simple act reminded him of one of Astrid's favorite sayings, that even the smallest light could push back the greatest darkness if tended with care and consistency. Perhaps that was the true measure of a life well lived, not the grand gestures or dramatic victories that found their way into songs and stories, but the quiet, consistent choices that created warmth and safety for those who mattered most. As he prepared to bank the fire for the night and seek his own rest, Einar felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path he had chosen, even if it had led him to this moment of solitude in a storm-battered longhole at the edge of the known world. The wind howled once more, and somewhere in its voice he thought he heard an echo of something else, a sound that might have been human voices crying out in distress. He paused, listening intently, but the storm swallowed all other sounds, leaving him uncertain whether his ears had detected something real or merely conjured phantoms from the loneliness and the late hour. The sound came again, carried on the wind like a whisper of desperation. Einar's warrior instincts, honed by decades of survival in these unforgiving lands, urged him toward the heavy oak door. He wrapped his thick wool cloak around his shoulders and stepped into the bitter night, the cold striking his face like a physical blow. The snow fell in thick curtains, each flake sharp and stinging against his exposed skin. The familiar landscape had been transformed into something alien and treacherous, where every landmark was buried beneath an ever-growing blanket of white. The wind howled with such ferocity that it seemed to carry the voices of angry spirits, but beneath that primal sound, Einar's trained ear detected something else, something distinctly human. He retrieved a torch from inside the hall, its flame dancing wildly in the storm, but providing enough light to guide his steps toward the river's edge. The path he had walked countless times was now invisible, marked only by the memory of his feet and the instinct that comes from a lifetime spent navigating these lands. Each step forward required careful consideration, as the snow had drifted to depths that could swallow a man's legs, and the hidden ice beneath could send even the surest foot sliding into darkness. The cry came once more, weaker now but unmistakably real. Einar quickened his pace, his massive frame cutting through the wind like a ship's prow through rough seas. His breath formed clouds of vapor that were immediately swept away by the relentless gale, and ice crystals formed in his beard with each exhalation. The torch guttered and nearly died twice, forcing him to shield it with his body while pressing forward into the maelstrom. At the river's bend, where the ancient stone markers stood guard like silent sentinels, he found them. Two figures lay partially buried in the snow, their bodies pressed together for warmth that was no longer sufficient to sustain life. The woman's arm was wrapped protectively around the man's shoulders, a gesture of love that spoke of decades spent facing hardships together. Their breathing was shallow, their lips blue with cold, their eyes closed against the storm that had nearly claimed them. Without hesitation, Einar knelt beside them, his torch planted firmly in the snow to provide what light it could. The man appeared to be in his 70th winter, his beard white as the snow that covered it. The woman seemed perhaps a few years younger, her silver hair escaping from beneath a simple woolen hood. Their clothing, though well made, was soaked through and stiffening with ice. They wore no jewelry or marks of rank, appearing for all the world like common travelers who had been caught in nature's fury. "Hold fast," Einar murmured, though he doubted they could hear him above the wind. "I will not let the storm take you." He lifted the woman first, cradling her frail form against his chest, with the same care he had once shown his own children. Her breathing was so faint he had to press his ear close to her lips to confirm life still flickered within her. The man proved heavier despite his age, but Einar's strength had been legendary even in his youth, and the years had taken little from his ability to bear such burdens. The journey back to the long haul became a battle against time and elements alike. Each step required tremendous effort, as the snow had deepened during his brief absence, and the wind seemed determined to drive him from his path. The torch had been abandoned by necessity, leaving only the memory of direction and the distant glow of his hearth to guide their way. Twice he stumbled, his cargo nearly slipping from his grasp, but each time his determination proved stronger than the storm's malice. Inside the warmth of his hall, Einar laid them carefully before the great hearth, where the fire's heat could begin the slow work of restoring life to bodies that had come too close to yielding it forever. He built up the flames until they roared with enough intensity to drive back the cold that had settled in their bones. The wet clothing had to be removed, a task he performed with the clinical efficiency of a man who had tended wounded warriors on many battlefields. The woman stirred first, her eyelids fluttering as warmth gradually penetrated the fog of near death that had claimed her consciousness. When her eyes finally opened, they held a clarity that surprised him, not the confused gaze of someone returning from the edge of oblivion, but the steady look of someone who had faced death before and found it familiar rather than frightening. "Where?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying an accent he couldn't quite place. "You are safe," Einar replied, kneeling beside her with a cup of warm broth prepared from his evening meal. "The storm nearly took you both, but you are in my hall now. Drink this slowly." The man recovered more gradually, his breathing deepening as his body began to respond to the life-giving warmth. When consciousness finally returned to him, his first concern was not for himself, but for his companion. "Freda," he said, reaching toward the woman with a trembling hand. "My heart, are you—" "I am here." "Asmund," she replied, catching his fingers with her own. "This good man pulled us from the storm's grasp." Their connection was immediately apparent, not just the bond of marriage, but something deeper, forged by shared trials and strengthened by years of facing hardships together. They looked at each other with the kind of understanding that only comes from a lifetime of partnership, communicating volumes with glances that required no words. Einar provided them with dry clothing from his own stores, garments that hung loose on their smaller frames but served to restore dignity along with warmth. As they recovered their strength, he prepared a proper meal, thick stew, rich with meat and vegetables, bread still warm from the morning's baking, and mead heated with herbs that would help drive the last traces of cold from their bones. "We are in your debt," Asmund said when he could speak without his voice shaking from the cold. "I fear we would not have seen another dawn without your kindness." "Any decent man would have done the same," Einar replied, though he knew this wasn't entirely true. Many would have turned away from the storm rather than venture into its teeth for strangers. "The weather has been treacherous for days. What brought you so far from shelter?" The elderly couple exchanged a look that held secrets, but neither seemed inclined to share their purpose immediately. Instead, Freda spoke with careful courtesy. "We were traveling to visit distant kin when the storm overtook us. Our horse went lame, and we thought we could reach the next settlement on foot." She gestured toward the windows, where the wind still howled with undiminished fury. "Pride and poor judgment nearly cost us everything." Einar accepted their explanation without pressing for details. In his experience, travelers often carried burdens that were their own business, and a wise host respected such boundaries. What mattered was that they were alive and gradually recovering from their ordeal. As the night progressed, he prepared sleeping places for them near the hearth, where the warmth would continue its healing work. The storm showed no signs of abating, and even if it had, they would need days to fully recover from their brush with death. He made it clear that they were welcome to stay as long as necessary, asking nothing in return except the simple pleasure of having voices other than his own break the hall's winter silence. "You have a good heart," Freda observed, as he arranged furs and blankets to create comfortable resting places. "In these times, such generosity has become rare." "Perhaps," Einar replied, thinking of his wife's teachings about hospitality and duty. "But a hall without guests is like a fire without fuel. It may burn, but it provides little light for others." Asmund studied him with eyes that seemed to weigh and measure more than just his words. "You speak like a man who has led others. There is wisdom in your voice that comes only from experience." "I have had responsibilities in these parts," Einar admitted without elaboration. "But tonight I am simply a man offering shelter to those who need it." As his guests settled into sleep, Einar remained awake, maintaining the fire and listening to the storm's continued assault on his long haul. Something about the elderly couple intrigued him, not just their obvious education and refinement, which spoke of higher birth than their simple clothing suggested, but the way they carried themselves despite their recent ordeal. There was a quiet dignity about them, a sense of authority that hadn't been diminished by their brush with death. Yet he respected their privacy, as was proper. Tomorrow, when they were stronger and the storm had passed, there would be time enough for stories and explanations. Tonight, it was enough that three souls had found warmth and safety in a world that offered precious little of either. The wind howled once more, rattling the shutters with renewed fury. But within the long hall's protective embrace, peace had settled over the unlikely gathering. Einar smiled slightly as he watched over his sleeping guests, thinking that perhaps his grandmother had been right about the gods' involvement in mortal affairs. Sometimes the storm brought destruction, but occasionally, just occasionally, it brought exactly what was needed most. Dawn brought a deceptive calm to the fjords. The storm had exhausted itself during the night, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow so deep it reached the long hall's lower windows. The world outside appeared pristine and peaceful, but Einar knew the danger hadn't passed. It had simply taken a different form. Travel would be impossible for days, perhaps weeks, until the drifts settled and paths could be cleared. He rose before his guests, as was his custom, to tend the fire and prepare the morning meal. The simple routine of domestic tasks brought him a sense of normalcy after the dramatic events of the previous night. As he worked quietly in the kitchen area, he found himself studying the sleeping couple with growing curiosity. Even in rest, they maintained an aura of dignity that spoke of lives lived in positions of authority. Asmund woke first, his eyes immediately seeking Freda to ensure her continued well-being. The gesture was so automatic, so ingrained, that it spoke of decades of protective care. When he noticed Einar preparing breakfast, he attempted to rise and assist, only to be gently but firmly directed back to his resting place. "You are guests in my hall," Einar said with quiet authority. "Your only duty is to recover your strength." "A man grows uncomfortable being served when he should be serving," Asmund replied, but he settled back against the furs with obvious relief. The ordeal had taken more from him than he wanted to admit. Frida stirred moments later, and Einar was struck again by the immediate alertness in her eyes. She assessed their surroundings with the quick, thorough glance of someone accustomed to evaluating new situations for both opportunity and threat. When she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable cadence of education and breeding. "The storm has passed?" she asked, though the question seemed more about confirming her assessment than seeking information. "For now," Einar replied, ladling thick porridge into wooden bowls. "But winter is far from finished with us. The snow lies too deep for safe travel, and more storms will come before spring releases its grip." Over the morning meal, conversation flowed more easily than it had the night before. Asmund and Freda proved to be engaging companions, well versed in topics ranging from the management of livestock to the intricacies of trade negotiations. Their knowledge seemed unusually comprehensive for simple travelers, covering subjects that typically occupied the attention of jarls and their advisors. "You maintain this hall alone?" Freda inquired, gesturing toward the well-ordered domestic arrangements that surrounded them. "Mostly," Einar admitted. "I have servants for the livestock and basic maintenance, but the long hall itself has been my responsibility since my wife's passing." The words carried the weight of 3 years' accumulated loneliness, though he spoke them without seeking sympathy. "She must have been a remarkable woman to help you create such a welcoming place," Asmund observed. "Her influence lingers in every carefully tended detail." The comment pleased Einar more than elaborate praise might have. These strangers had recognized Astrid's continued presence in the hall's atmosphere, something that spoke well of their perceptiveness and sensitivity. He found himself sharing memories of his wife that he rarely discussed with others: her skill at weaving, her talent for mediating disputes, her ability to make even the humblest meal feel like a feast through the warmth of her attention. As the day progressed, Einar began to notice subtle details about his guests that reinforced his growing conviction that they were more than they appeared. Asmund's hands, though weathered by age, bore the calluses of someone who had wielded weapons regularly rather than farm tools. Freda's posture, even when seated, suggested a lifetime of formal training in deportment and protocol. Most telling of all, they both displayed an unconscious expectation of deference that spoke of authority exercised over long periods. Yet, they maintained their simple story of being travelers caught in the storm. Einar respected their privacy while filing away each observation for future consideration. Years of leadership had taught him the value of patience when dealing with mysteries that would reveal themselves in their own time. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Henrik, the elderly man who tended Einar's livestock, arrived at the hall with news that would have been troubling under normal circumstances, but was particularly worrisome given the current conditions. 3 of the ewes are showing signs of sickness," he reported, his weathered face creased with concern. "Started yesterday, but I hoped it was just the cold. Now it looks like something more serious." Einar's expression grew grave. Livestock disease in winter could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The animals represented not just immediate food sources, but the foundation of spring breeding that would determine the following year's prosperity. He would need to examine the sick animals immediately and make difficult decisions about isolation and possible culling. "I must see to this," he explained to his guests. "Make yourselves comfortable. There are books on the shelf if you wish to read, and the fire should hold until my return." Asmund stood with surprising spryness for someone who had been near death less than a day earlier. "Freda has considerable experience with animal husbandry, and I have some knowledge of livestock diseases." The offer surprised Einar, both for its promptness and its specificity. Common travelers might have general familiarity with animals, but their confidence suggested deeper expertise. Still, he was grateful for any help with what promised to be a challenging situation. The sheep shelter lay a short walk from the main hall, though the journey required careful navigation through snowdrifts that reached above their knees in places. Henrik had done his best to maintain paths between the buildings, but the storm's fury had overwhelmed his efforts. The 3 of them moved slowly but steadily, with Einar breaking trail for his older companions. Inside the shelter, the sick ewes displayed symptoms that immediately caught Freda's attention. She examined them with the systematic thoroughness of someone well versed in animal medicine. Her hands, gentle but confident as she checked their breathing, felt for fever, and inspected their eyes and mouths. "This is not a disease," she announced after completing her examination. "They have been poisoned by something they ate, likely bitter herbs that became concentrated under the snow." Her diagnosis proved accurate. A careful search of the animal's recent grazing area revealed patches of toxic plants that had been covered by early snowfall and then exposed again as the animals poured through the drifts, seeking forage. The solution was relatively simple: activated charcoal and careful monitoring, but without Freida's expertise, Einar might have lost valuable livestock to a misunderstood ailment. "You have saved me considerable loss," he told her as they walked back toward the hall through the deepening afternoon shadows. "Such knowledge comes only from extensive experience." "I have always had a way with animals," she replied, but her tone suggested this was an understatement of significant proportions. The evening meal passed with renewed appreciation for the unexpected turn their relationship had taken. What had begun as simple hospitality extended to strangers was evolving into something resembling genuine partnership. Asmund and Freida proved to be valuable contributors to the hall's daily operations, offering insights and assistance that went far beyond the normal expectations of guests. As they settled before the fire for the night, Einar found himself reflecting on how dramatically his solitary existence had changed in the span of a single day. The long hall felt alive again, filled with the kind of purposeful activity and meaningful conversation that had been absent since Astrid's death. He began to hope that his guests would remain for the full duration of winter, bringing their wisdom and companionship to lighten the burden of the cold months ahead. Yet, beneath his growing appreciation for their presence lay a persistent curiosity about their true identities and purposes. The pieces of evidence were accumulating: their education, their expertise, their unconscious assumption of authority, but the complete picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. Einar suspected that when the truth finally emerged, it would prove far more significant than their modest appearance suggested. For now, though, he was content to enjoy the simple pleasure of shared warmth and good company during winter's reign. Whatever secrets his guests carried could wait for spring's revelation. The next 3 days brought a rhythm to the long haul that Einar had not experienced since his wife's death. Asmund proved to be an excellent storyteller, regaling them with tales that seemed to come from intimate knowledge rather than mere repetition. His accounts of ancient battles carried the weight of personal observation, while his descriptions of various jarls and their territories displayed the kind of detailed familiarity that spoke of direct involvement in high-level politics. Freida demonstrated an equally impressive array of skills. She took over the preparation of their evening meals, transforming Einar's simple fare into dishes that would have graced the tables of nobility. Her knowledge of herbs and their properties extended far beyond the medical applications she had shown with the livestock, encompassing subtle flavoring techniques that suggested formal training in the culinary arts. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Einar asked one evening as he savored a stew that had been elevated from basic sustenance to genuine pleasure through her careful attention to seasoning and preparation. "A woman learns many things over the course of a long life," she replied with a smile that suggested both truth and deliberate evasion, "especially when she has been responsible for feeding others who depend on her." The comment reinforced Einar's growing conviction that his guests had held positions of significant responsibility, but he continued to respect their apparent desire for privacy. Their presence brought such warmth to his previously solitary existence that he was reluctant to press for information that might cause them to withdraw or depart prematurely. On the 4th day after the rescue, Margit arrived at the hall with disturbing news from the outside world. The cook's usual cheerful demeanor was clouded with worry as she reported what she had learned from a messenger who had struggled through the snow-clogged passes. "Raiders have been spotted in the eastern settlements," she announced, her voice tight with concern. 3 farmsteads burned, livestock stolen, families fled to the fortified towns for protection. The news struck Einar like a physical blow. Raiding during winter was almost unheard of. The risks were too great, the potential rewards too small to justify such desperate measures. Only the most ruthless or desperate groups would attempt such attacks when survival itself demanded all available energy and resources. Which direction were they moving? he asked, his mind already shifting to the strategic considerations that had occupied so much of his attention during the turbulent years of his youth. South and west, following the river valleys where the snow lies less deep, Margit replied. The messenger said they number perhaps 30 men, well armed and showing no mercy to those who resist. Asmund and Freda exchanged a look that carried layers of meaning Einar couldn't quite decipher. Both seemed disturbed by the news, but not in the way that ordinary travelers might be. Their reaction suggested personal investment rather than general concern for distant strangers. "Have you sent word to the neighboring jarls?" Freda asked, addressing Einar with the directness of someone accustomed to discussing military matters. "Messages are already being prepared," Einar confirmed, though he wondered at her immediate focus on coordinated response rather than personal safety. But the snow will slow communication, and gathering sufficient force to pursue raiders in these conditions will prove challenging. The conversation that followed revealed depths of strategic thinking from both his guests that further reinforced his suspicions about their true backgrounds. Asmund demonstrated intimate knowledge of winter warfare tactics, while Freda showed familiarity with the complexities of organizing multi-settlement defensive alliances. Their insights proved so valuable that Einar found himself treating them less like rescued travelers and more like trusted advisors. "The raiders are likely counting on the weather to prevent organized pursuit," Asmund observed. "They will strike quickly and retreat to prepared positions where they can wait out the worst of winter before moving on to other targets. Unless they are challenged immediately," Freda added. "Raiders rely on fear as much as force. If they encounter determined resistance, they often seek easier prey rather than risk heavy casualties." Their analysis proved disturbingly accurate. Over the next 2 days, additional reports arrived, describing a pattern of swift attacks followed by rapid withdrawal. The raiders seemed to possess excellent knowledge of local terrain and weather patterns, suggesting either extensive preparation or guidance from someone familiar with the region. Einar found himself increasingly torn between his responsibilities to his own people and the growing certainty that his guests were not what they appeared to be. Their insights were too precise, their knowledge too comprehensive for simple travelers. Yet pressing them for explanations risked alienating the very people whose counsel had become invaluable in dealing with the crisis. The dilemma resolved itself in an unexpected way. On the 6th evening after their rescue, as they sat before the fire discussing the latest reports of raider activity, Frida made a comment that revealed more than she had perhaps intended. "The eastern settlements have always been vulnerable to this type of attack," she said, then paused, as if realizing she had spoken from knowledge that required explanation. "Any settlement so far from central authority would face such challenges. But the damage was done." Her intimate familiarity with the region's strategic weaknesses, combined with her use of the phrase "central authority," painted a picture that could no longer be ignored. Asmund seemed to realize his companion had revealed too much, and his expression grew thoughtful as he weighed the implications of continued deception. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the time has come for greater honesty between us." Einar waited, his pulse quickening with the anticipation of finally learning the truth about his mysterious guests. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the moment. Outside, the wind had begun to rise again, suggesting that another storm was approaching to test their resolve and their newfound understanding. "We are indeed travelers caught by the storm," Asmund began. "But our journey had a specific purpose, and our destination was not distant kin." He glanced at Freda, who nodded encouragingly. "We came to this region seeking someone whose reputation for honor and wisdom had reached even our remote home." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from the fire, heavy with implications that would reshape everything Einar thought he understood about the past week. His mind raced through the possibilities, trying to reconcile this new information with everything he had observed about his guests. "Who were you seeking?" he asked, though part of him suspected he already knew the answer. You, Freda said simply. We came seeking Einar the Broadshield, whose justice and mercy have become legend even in places you have never seen. The words struck him with the force of revelation, recontextualizing every interaction, every shared meal, every moment of growing friendship. They had not been chance victims of the storm, but deliberate seekers who had found exactly what they were looking for, though not in the way they had planned. As the implications settled over him like falling snow, Einar realized that his simple act of rescue had set in motion events whose full significance remained hidden in the darkness beyond the fire's warm glow. The silence that followed Freda's revelation stretched between them like a bridge neither was certain they should cross. Einar studied their faces in the firelight, searching for deception, but finding only the weight of truth finally released from its burden of secrecy. His mind worked through the implications of their admission. Strangers who had traveled through dangerous winter conditions specifically to find him could only mean one thing. The quiet life he had built for himself was about to be irrevocably changed. My reputation has been greatly exaggerated, he said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of humility and wariness. I am simply a man who tries to protect what is his and treat others with the respect they deserve. Asmund leaned forward, his aged features earnest in the dancing light. That is precisely why we sought you. In a world where power too often corrupts and authority becomes tyranny, your approach to leadership has become something rare and precious. Leadership of what? Einar asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer would complicate his existence beyond anything he had previously imagined. Freda and Asmund exchanged another of those meaningful glances that spoke of decades of shared understanding. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of revelation that would reshape everything he thought he knew about the visitors the storm had delivered to his door. We are the last rulers of the hill people, the clan of the high valleys that your grandfather's grandfather once knew as allies and trading partners, she said, her voice taking on a formal cadence that suggested these were words she had prepared for this moment. Our people have lived in secret for 2 generations, hidden from the world that forgot us after the great wars that ravaged these lands. The name stirred memories from the deepest recesses of Einar's childhood, fragments of stories his grandmother had told him about the mysterious folk who lived in the highest reaches of the mountains. He had always assumed they were tales meant to entertain children, not historical accounts of actual people who had somehow survived in the harsh wilderness beyond the reach of normal civilization. The hill people were destroyed, he said, repeating what he had always believed to be historical fact. The Chronicles speak of their annihilation during the Wars of Unification. The Chronicles speak of what we wanted them to speak of, Asmund replied with a slight smile that held both pride and sadness. Sometimes survival requires the world to believe you no longer exist. We retreated so far into the mountains that even the birds rarely found us, building new settlements in places so remote that no army would think to look for us there. Einar's worldview shifted as he absorbed this information. Everything he thought he knew about the history of his region suddenly required re-examination. The hill people had been legendary for their skill in mountain warfare, their knowledge of hidden passes, and their ability to appear and disappear like ghosts made of mist and stone. If they truly had survived, their continued existence represented a power that could reshape the balance of the entire northern territories. "Why reveal yourselves now?" he asked, his strategic mind already working through the implications of such a momentous secret being shared with him. Freda's expression grew grave as she prepared to share what was clearly the heart of their mission. "Because our isolation, while it preserved our lives, has also led to our decline. Our young people grow restless in the hidden valleys, seeking adventure and purpose in the wider world. Our numbers dwindle with each passing year, and our ancient knowledge dies with the elders who have no worthy successors. We face a choice, Asmund added, his voice heavy with the weight of decisions that would determine the fate of his people. We can continue our isolation until we fade into nothing more than legend, or we can emerge from hiding and reclaim our place in the world. But such a return requires leadership that our young people will respect and the other clans will acknowledge. The pieces of their purpose began falling into place in Einar's mind, creating a picture that both honored and terrified him. You want me to lead your people back into the world. We want you to lead our warriors. Freda corrected. The hill people have always chosen their war chiefs based on merit rather than bloodline. Our own children, for all their courage and skill, lack the wisdom that comes from leading in times of genuine peace as well as conflict. They need someone who has proven that strength and honor can coexist. The magnitude of what they were offering struck him like a physical blow. To lead the legendary hill people would be to command a force that could reshape the political landscape of the entire region. Their warriors were spoken of in hushed tones, even in the old stories, described as fighters who could scale impossible cliffs and strike from directions that seemed impossible to defend against. "How many warriors are we discussing?" he asked, his practical mind needing concrete details to process the enormity of their proposal. 200 who have reached fighting age, Asmund replied, each trained from childhood in the old ways, each carrying weapons forged by smiths whose techniques have been preserved since before the Great Wars. They are young and eager for glory, but they have never faced real combat or tested their skills against worthy opponents. Einar rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that had been his entire world for so long. The familiar valleys and hills suddenly seemed smaller, constrained by the revelation that beyond them lay hidden settlements filled with people whose very existence challenged everything he thought he understood about his place in the larger scheme of things. "The raiders," he said suddenly, turning back to face his guests. "You knew about them before Margit brought the news." Freda nodded gravely. "They are part of why we had to accelerate our plans. The raiders are not random bandits seeking winter plunder. They are scouts, testing the defenses and determination of the settled peoples. Behind them comes a larger force that seeks to carve out territory in these northern lands." "How much larger?" Einar asked, though the grim expressions on their faces already suggested an answer he would not like. "Perhaps 500 warriors, led by a warlord who calls himself Ironbone the Ruthless," Asmund replied. "He has been gathering desperate men and displaced fighters for 2 years, promising them land and plunder if they follow him in the conquest of what he considers poorly defended territory." The strategic picture was becoming clearer, and it painted a future that would be shaped by conflict, regardless of what choice Einar made. The hill people needed a leader to guide their return to the world, while the settled peoples needed a defender against the approaching threat. The convergence of these needs was almost certainly not coincidental. "You planned this," he said, not accusingly, but with the respect due to a well-executed strategy. "The timing of your arrival, the revelation of your identities, even perhaps your encounter with the storm, all of it designed to place me in a position where I would have no choice but to accept your proposal." "We planned to reach you before the raiders arrived in force," Freda admitted. "The storm was nature's own contribution to our strategy, though it nearly cost us everything. Your rescue of us was genuine kindness, not political maneuvering, which is precisely why you are the leader our people need." Einar returned to his chair, his mind weighing factors that would determine not just his own future, but the fate of thousands of people he had never met. The comfortable solitude of his long haul had been shattered by revelations that demanded action, commitment, and the acceptance of responsibilities that dwarfed anything he had previously undertaken. "If I refuse," he asked, though he already suspected the answer, "then our people remain hidden, while Ironbone's forces ravage the settlements, and both our cultures suffer losses that may prove irreversible." Asmund replied with calm honesty. "You would not be forced to live with that burden alone, but you would have to live with it nonetheless. The weight of decision pressed down upon him like the accumulated snow outside his hall, heavy with the potential for both creation and destruction. Whatever choice he made would ripple outward through countless lives, shaping a future that currently existed only in the realm of possibility. Outside, the wind began to howl again, as if the very elements were demanding an answer to the question that now defined his existence. Sleep proved elusive that night, as Einar wrestled with the enormity of the decision before him. He lay on his sleeping furs, staring at the smoke-darkened beams overhead, while his mind churned through possibilities and consequences. In the space of a single evening, his carefully ordered world had been turned inside out by revelations that challenged everything he thought he knew about his purpose and place in the larger scheme of existence. The sound of quiet conversation drew his attention to where Asmund and Freda lay near the dying fire. Their voices carried just enough to make individual words distinguishable, and what he heard only added to his understanding of the complexity surrounding their proposal. "The young ones grow more restless with each passing season," Freda was saying, her tone heavy with concern. "Bjorn and his followers speak openly of abandoning the hidden valleys to seek their fortunes as mercenaries in the lowlands. They do not understand what they would lose," Asmund replied. "The freedom to walk away from a battle that cannot be won, the security of retreat routes known only to our people, the strength that comes from fighting on familiar ground, all of it would be sacrificed for the illusion of glory in foreign wars." Einar closed his eyes and forced his breathing to remain steady, not wanting to interrupt what was clearly a private discussion between two leaders struggling with the survival of their people. Yet their words painted a picture that added urgency to their earlier revelations. "Einar is our best hope," Freda continued. "His reputation reaches even our hidden valleys. The young warriors speak of him with the kind of respect they show for no other lowland leader. If anyone can channel their desire for honor into something greater than mere adventuring, it is he." "Assuming he accepts," Asmund said quietly, "we are asking him to abandon the life he has built for himself, to leave behind the familiar for the unknown. Few men would willingly make such a choice." "He will accept," Freda said with quiet certainty, "not because he seeks power or glory, but because he cannot turn away from people who need his help. It is both his greatest strength and his most exploitable weakness." The conversation shifted to other matters, but Einar had heard enough to understand that his choice would determine far more than just his own future. The hill people faced internal divisions that threatened their unity, while external pressures from Ironbone's approaching army created a timeline that would not wait for careful deliberation. Morning brought fresh snow, and a messenger whose arrival changed the strategic landscape yet again. The man rode a horse that was clearly near exhaustion, both rider and mount bearing the marks of desperate travel through treacherous conditions. His news justified the risks he had taken to deliver it. "Ironbone's main force has been sighted." The messenger gasped as Einar helped him from his saddle. 3 days' march from the eastern settlements, moving in full battle array. They fly banners that mark them as a serious army, not just a raiding band. The timeline had just accelerated beyond anyone's expectations. 3 days meant that within a week, possibly less, a force of 500 warriors would be striking at settlements that could field perhaps 50 defenders between them. The mathematics of the situation were brutal in their simplicity. Asmund and Frida absorbed this news with the calm that comes from having anticipated its eventual arrival. They had clearly been planning for this moment, and the confirmation of their fears seemed to strengthen their resolve rather than shake it. "How long would it take to gather your warriors?" Einar asked, the question itself serving as preliminary acceptance of their proposal. "They can be here in 2 days," Asmund replied without hesitation. "We prepared for this possibility before beginning our journey. Signal fires have been laid in the high passes, and scouts wait to carry word to our hidden settlements." The efficiency of their preparation impressed Einar, even as it confirmed his suspicion that this entire encounter had been orchestrated with strategic precision. They had not come to him as a last resort, but as the culmination of careful planning that had anticipated multiple contingencies. "What weapons do they carry?" he asked, his military mind already beginning to assess the tactical possibilities. "Each warrior bears a sword, forged in the old manner, with steel that will hold an edge through the longest battle," Freda replied. "They carry shields of oak and iron, spears with points of the finest metal, and bows carved from wood that grows only in our highest valleys. Their arrows can pierce mail at distances that would surprise even experienced fighters. Armor, chain mail for the leaders, leather reinforced with metal plates for the others," Asmund added. "They are equipped for serious warfare, not mere skirmishing." Einar nodded, his estimation of their military potential rising with each detail. 200 well-equipped warriors led by experienced commanders could indeed make the difference between victory and catastrophe in the coming conflict. Yet questions remained about the wisdom of revealing the hill people's existence to the wider world. Their secrecy had preserved them for generations, and abandoning it now would expose them to risks that went far beyond the immediate threat posed by Ironbone's army. "After this battle," he said, voicing the concern that nagged at his strategic thinking, "your people will no longer be hidden. Every Jarl and king in the northern territories will know that the hill people have returned. Some will seek alliance, but others will see you as a threat to be eliminated. Which is why we need a leader who can navigate those political waters," Freda replied. "Our young warriors are brave and skilled, but they lack experience in the kind of diplomacy that will be required to secure our place in the new world we are creating." The weight of their trust settled on his shoulders like a mantle woven from responsibility and hope. They were offering him not just military command, but political leadership of a people whose very survival would depend on decisions he would make in the challenging years ahead. "There is something else you should know," Asmund said, his voice taking on the formal tone that marked particularly important revelations. "Our people possess certain advantages that have been preserved since the ancient days. Knowledge of secret paths through the mountains, techniques for warfare in terrain that would defeat conventional armies, and alliances with others who have chosen isolation over submission." Einar raised an eyebrow at this hint of additional resources. "What kind of alliances?" "The sea wolves of the northern islands maintain contact with our settlements," Freda explained. "Small groups of raiders who never submitted to any king, preferring freedom on the waves to security on land. They could provide naval support if the conflict expands beyond these territories." The strategic picture was becoming more complex with each revelation. What had begun as a simple choice between accepting or refusing leadership was evolving into something resembling the formation of a new power structure in the northern regions. The hill people, the sea wolves, and whatever other hidden groups remained in contact represented a potential confederation that could challenge the established order. "You are asking me to lead not just your warriors, but a revolution," Einar observed, his voice carrying both admiration for their vision and concern about its implications. "We are asking you to lead the creation of something new," Asmund corrected. "A confederation based on mutual respect rather than conquest, on protection rather than predation. The old ways are failing. Ironbone's army is proof of that. We need new approaches to survive in a changing world." Outside, the wind had begun to rise again, and with it came the sound of distant horns, the signal system that Einar's people used to communicate across the scattered settlements. The pattern was one he recognized with a chill of foreboding. "Enemy sighted. Prepare for battle." The time for careful consideration had run out. Somewhere beyond the snow-covered hills, Ironbone's army was moving closer to a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone in the region. Einar's choice could no longer be postponed. He stood and walked to the great chest where his father's weapons waited, lifting the lid to reveal steel that had tasted victory in battles whose outcomes had shaped the history of these lands. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority that had made him a respected leader among his peers. "Send your signal," he told Asmund. "Call your warriors to gather. We have work to do." The die had been cast, and the future would be shaped by the courage and wisdom of those who chose to stand against the darkness gathering beyond the horizon. The signal fires blazed across the mountain peaks that night, their light carrying messages in a code that had been preserved for generations in the hidden settlements of the hill people. Einar watched from his long hall's highest window as the ancient communication system awakened, transforming the dark landscape into a constellation of purposeful flames that spoke of mobilization and resolve. By dawn, the first scouts had arrived, young men who moved across the snow-covered terrain with the silent efficiency of wolves. They reported to Asmund with the disciplined respect of warriors who understood the gravity of the situation, their words painting a picture of rapid deployment that impressed even Einar's experienced military mind. "The warbands are moving," the lead scout reported. 200 warriors will gather at the stone circle by midday. They bring full battle gear and provisions for extended campaign. Einar had heard of the stone circle in the old tales, a massive ring of ancient monoliths that supposedly marked a gathering place for the hill people in the days before their retreat into hiding. That it still existed and maintained its ceremonial significance spoke to the remarkable preservation of their culture during decades of isolation. "How long to reach this gathering place?" Einar asked, already calculating the logistics of moving from his long haul to an assembly point he had never seen. 3 hours through the hidden paths," Asmund replied. "The way is treacherous, but known to our guides. We must depart within the hour if we are to arrive before the warriors begin to wonder whether their summons will be answered." The urgency was unmistakable, but as they prepared to leave the familiar comfort of the long haul, a commotion outside announced the arrival of unexpected visitors. Henrik burst through the door without his customary knock, his weathered face pale with alarm. "My lord," he gasped, "riders approach under a banner I do not recognize. Armed men, perhaps 20 in number, riding hard despite the snow." Einar's hand moved instinctively toward his sword as he considered the possibilities. Ironbone's scouts arriving ahead of schedule, desperate refugees fleeing the approaching army, or perhaps messengers from neighboring jarls seeking coordination in the face of the growing threat. None of the options promised pleasant developments. Through the window, he could see the riders emerging from the tree line that marked the southern approach to his holding. Their horses moved with the disciplined formation of experienced cavalry, and their equipment gleamed with the quality that marked professional warriors rather than desperate bandits. "That banner," Freda said, her voice tight with recognition and something approaching fear. "I know those colors." Before she could elaborate, the riders had reached the long hall's entrance. Their leader dismounted with fluid grace and approached the door with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being received with respect. When Einar opened it, he found himself facing a woman whose presence commanded immediate attention. She stood perhaps as tall as his shoulder, with silver-streaked hair braided in the complex patterns that marked northern nobility. Her armor was functional rather than decorative, showing the wear that came from actual use rather than ceremonial display. Most striking of all were her eyes, pale blue and sharp, with intelligence that seemed to catalogue every detail of her surroundings. "I am Valdis Ironborn," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of one who had never doubted her right to speak and be heard. "I seek audience with Einar the Broadshield on matters of mutual urgency." The name struck him like a physical blow. Ironborn, the surname that marked her as kin to Ironbone the Ruthless, the warlord whose approaching army had precipitated the current crisis. Yet her manner suggested negotiation rather than conquest, diplomacy rather than warfare. "You are welcome in my hall." Einar replied, falling back on the ancient protocols of hospitality, even as his mind raced through the implications of her presence. Though I confess your arrival raises questions that I hope you will address. She entered with her warriors, who arranged themselves with professional competence while maintaining respectful distance from their hosts. As she removed her traveling cloak, Einar noticed details that complicated his understanding of the situation. Her weapons were well maintained but not ostentatious, her jewelry spoke of wealth but not excess, and her bearing suggested someone accustomed to command but not drunk on power. You wonder about my relationship to the warlord whose army threatens these lands, she said without preamble, demonstrating the directness that had apparently brought her through dangerous territory to reach him. Ironbone is my brother, and I have come to prevent a war that will benefit no one except the carrion birds. The revelation transformed the entire strategic landscape in a single moment. The approaching conflict was not simply about defending against external aggression, it was about a family divided, with stakes that went far beyond territorial conquest. Your brother's raiders have already struck, Einar pointed out, his tone carefully neutral as he assessed this unexpected development. Blood has been spilled, property destroyed. The momentum toward war may be beyond anyone's ability to halt. Valdis nodded grimly. I know of the raids, and I know they were not authorized by my brother's direct command. Some of his captains have grown impatient with the pace of his campaign and have acted independently, believing they were advancing his cause. Are you here to negotiate on his behalf? Freda asked, her voice carrying undertones that suggested complicated recognition of their visitor's identity. I am here to offer an alternative to the bloodbath that will result if my brother's army meets the resistance that is gathering against him, Valdis replied. But first, I must ask why the last rulers of the hill people sit in this hall discussing strategy with the man my brother intends to challenge for leadership of these territories. The silence that followed her words carried the weight of exposed secrets and shattered assumptions. Somehow, this woman possessed knowledge of the hill people's existence and their current activities, information that should have been impossible for any outsider to acquire. Asmund and Freda exchanged glances that spoke of contingencies they had hoped would never arise. When Asmund spoke, his voice carried the dignity of one who had long ago accepted that important secrets would eventually require explanation. Our people have maintained certain alliances over the generations, he said carefully. Information flows through channels that most believe no longer exist, including channels that reach my brother's court, Valdis confirmed. He has known about the hill people for months, though he has chosen not to share that knowledge with his war captains. Your emergence from hiding is part of what prompted his decision to accelerate his campaign. Einar felt the ground shifting beneath him as the true complexity of the situation revealed itself. What he had understood as a straightforward conflict between defenders and aggressors was actually a multi-layered political crisis involving hidden peoples, family loyalties, and intelligence networks that had remained active across generations of supposed separation. What does your brother truly want? He asked, recognizing that the answer would determine whether negotiation remained possible or whether they were all committed to a path that led inevitably to battlefield resolution. Valdis studied him with those pale eyes that seemed to weigh both his words and his character before answering. He wants to create a new kingdom in the northern territories, one that unifies the scattered settlements under a single strong ruler. The problem is that he believes such unification can only be achieved through conquest and submission, and you believe otherwise. I believe that leaders who inspire loyalty through fear eventually discover that fear is an unreliable foundation for lasting power, she replied. My brother is not evil, but he is convinced that strength must be demonstrated through dominance. I have come to propose an alternative demonstration. The proposal she outlined in the next few minutes would have seemed impossible under any other circumstances. Instead of the approaching war that everyone had assumed inevitable, She suggested a different kind of confrontation, one that would determine leadership through trial by combat rather than wholesale battlefield slaughter. Let the strongest champions of each side meet in single combat, she proposed. Winner takes leadership of all forces, both armies, and the responsibility for creating the unity that everyone claims to desire. Einar found himself staring at a woman who had just suggested he stake everything on his ability to defeat her brother in personal combat, with the fate of thousands riding on the outcome of their individual struggle. "And if I refuse this proposal, then my brother's army will arrive as planned. Your hill people warriors will meet them in battle, and hundreds of good men will die to determine something that could be settled between two," she replied with stark honesty. "The mathematics are simple, even if the choice is not." Outside, the signal fires continued burning, calling warriors to a gathering that might now determine the course of a very different kind of conflict than anyone had anticipated. The storm that had brought Asmund and Frida to his door was proving to be merely the first in a series of upheavals that would reshape everything he thought he understood about his destiny. The choice before him had suddenly become both simpler and more terrifying. Accept personal responsibility for the outcome through single combat, or watch the region burn while armies settled the matter through mass slaughter. In the space of a single morning, his path toward leadership of the hill people had transformed into something that resembled the ancient trials of heroes more than the strategic decisions of modern warfare. The weight of individual destiny had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, with winter wind howling outside and the future balanced on the edge of a blade that only he could wield. The journey to the stone circle took place through terrain that seemed carved from legend itself. Ancient paths wound between towering peaks where the wind carried voices from a time before memory, and the very stones beneath their feet bore the marks of countless generations who had walked these ways. Einar rode between worlds. Behind him lay the familiar comfort of his long haul and the life he had built through careful choices, while ahead waited a destiny that would be forged in combat before witnesses whose judgment would echo through the ages. Valdis had insisted on accompanying them, bringing her warriors as neutral observers who could testify to the legitimacy of whatever outcome emerged from the trial by combat. Her presence complicated an already tense situation, but her knowledge of her brother's strengths and weaknesses proved invaluable as they discussed the parameters of the coming confrontation. "Ironbone fights with an axe that has been in our family for 7 generations, she explained, as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of the mountain path. "The weapon is perfectly balanced for his fighting style, and he has trained with it since childhood. His reach is considerable, and his strength is legendary, even among warriors who respect nothing but prowess in battle." Einar absorbed this information while mentally reviewing his own combat experience. He had faced skilled opponents before, but always as part of larger conflicts where strategy and circumstance could compensate for individual disadvantages. Single combat stripped away all such advantages, reducing victory to the fundamental question of who possessed greater skill, strength, and determination when everything else was eliminated. "What drives him?" Einar asked. Recognizing that understanding his opponent's motivation might prove as important as knowing his fighting techniques. "What convinced a man with your family's obvious nobility to choose the path of conquest?" Valdis was quiet for a long moment, her expression reflecting the complicated emotions that came with discussing a beloved sibling whose choices had led them to opposite sides of an approaching conflict. "Our father died when we were young," she said finally, "killed in a dispute with a neighboring Jarl who coveted our family's holdings. The killer faced no consequences because he possessed more warriors and stronger alliances than we could muster. Ironbone learned that day that justice belongs to those with the power to enforce it, and he has spent his life ensuring he would never again be on the weaker side of such an equation." The explanation painted a picture that Einar recognized from his own experience with leadership and its burdens. The desire to protect those under your care could lead to choices that seemed reasonable in isolation, but accumulated into something that resembled tyranny when viewed from the outside. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape revealed traces of the hill people's presence that had been invisible from the lower elevations. Carefully camouflaged watchtowers commanded strategic views of the approaches, while hidden defensive positions could channel any attacking force into killing grounds where terrain would favor the defenders. The military engineering was subtle but sophisticated, speaking to generations of careful preparation for conflicts that might never come. "Your people have not forgotten the arts of war," Einar observed to Asmund, who rode beside him with the easy confidence of someone returning to familiar territory. "We have had time to perfect them," Asmund replied. "Isolation provides many gifts, but perhaps the most valuable is the opportunity to think deeply about problems that others must solve in haste. Our young warriors have trained on these slopes since they could walk, learning to use every stone and tree to maximum advantage." The stone circle itself appeared gradually as they crested the final ridge, its massive monoliths rising from a natural amphitheater that could accommodate hundreds of spectators while providing clear sightlines to the central area where the combat would take place. The stones themselves were far older than any human settlement in the region, their surfaces carved with symbols that predated written history but somehow conveyed meaning that transcended language. The hill people warriors had arrived before them, their camp arranged with military precision around the ancient gathering place. 200 men in their prime, each bearing equipment that gleamed with careful maintenance and deadly purpose. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of soldiers who had trained together extensively, but their eyes held the eager intensity of young fighters who had never tested their skills in genuine combat. Their greeting of Asmund and Freda demonstrated the deep respect they held for their leaders, but when Einar dismounted and walked among them, he felt the weight of evaluation that marked their assessment of his worthiness to command them. These warriors had heard stories of his reputation, but stories were not sufficient foundation for the trust they would need to place in his leadership if the trial by combat failed to resolve the larger conflict. "Who leads them in battle?" he asked Freda quietly, as they observed the warriors making final preparations for the ceremony that would formalize his acceptance of their allegiance. "Bjorn Ironwill, grandson of my sister and heir to the war leadership, if Asmund and I should fall," she replied, indicating a tall young man whose bearing suggested both confidence and carefully controlled ambition. "He has the skill and courage to command, but lacks the tempering that comes from facing genuine adversity. His greatest fear is that our people will fade into irrelevance rather than reclaim their place in the world." Einar studied the young warrior who might become his lieutenant or his rival, depending on how events unfolded. Bjorn moved among his men with natural authority, checking equipment and offering encouragement with the practiced ease of someone who had grown up expecting to lead. Yet there was something in his expression that suggested frustration with the constraints that had shaped his life thus far. The formal ceremony of acceptance took place as the sun reached its zenith, casting shadows from the ancient stones across the assembled warriors in patterns that seemed to connect past and present in a single moment of destiny. Einar stood before the gathered hill people and spoke words that bound him to their service, while accepting the responsibility for their survival and prosperity. "I take up this burden not for glory or personal advancement, but because the alternative is to watch good men die needlessly while their enemies profit from division," he declared, his voice carrying clearly to every warrior present. "Together we will face whatever challenges arise, and together we will prove that honor and strength can coexist without requiring the subjugation of others." The response was immediate and overwhelming. 200 voices raised in unison, proclaiming their readiness to follow where he led and to stand firm against whatever forces threatened their newfound unity. The sound echoed from the mountain peaks like thunder, carrying with it the accumulated power of a people who had preserved their identity through generations of hardship and were finally ready to reclaim their place in the world. But beneath the ceremony and celebration lay the grim knowledge that words alone would not determine the outcome of the crisis they faced. Somewhere beyond the mountains, Ironbone's army continued its advance toward a confrontation that could still result in massive bloodshed if the trial by combat failed to provide definitive resolution. As evening approached, messengers arrived with news that compressed the timeline even further. Ironbone himself had accepted his sister's proposal for single combat, but he had also accelerated his army's movement to ensure they would reach the agreed-upon battlefield within 2 days. The margin for preparation was shrinking rapidly. Einar spent those final hours in intensive discussion with the Hill People's most experienced fighters, absorbing decades of accumulated knowledge about mountain warfare, weather patterns, and the subtle advantages that could make the difference between victory and defeat. Their insights proved invaluable, but they also emphasized the reality that much would depend on factors beyond anyone's control. The combat will take place at dawn on the 3rd day, Valdis informed him as they made final preparations for the journey to the chosen battlefield. "My brother prefers to fight when his strength is at its peak, and the morning light will ensure that neither combatant can claim disadvantage from shadows or uncertain footing." The location itself had been chosen for its symbolic significance, a flat expanse of stone that had served as a dueling ground for generations, surrounded by natural seating where witnesses could observe without interfering. It was a place where individual prowess would be tested without the complications that terrain or circumstance might introduce. On the final night before departure, Einar found himself standing alone among the ancient stones, contemplating the magnitude of what he had undertaken. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier, but it was balanced by the certainty that he had chosen the only path that offered hope for avoiding catastrophic loss of life. The wind that whistled between the monoliths carried the voices of his ancestors, warriors who had faced similar moments when individual courage could determine the fate of many. Their whispered encouragement reminded him that he stood in a tradition that stretched back to the earliest days of his people, when heroes were defined not by their invincibility, but by their willingness to risk everything for principles that mattered more than personal survival. Tomorrow would bring the final test of strength, skill, and determination. Tonight, he prepared his spirit for a battle that would echo through legend, regardless of its outcome. The ancient dueling ground lay shrouded in morning mist when the two armies converged upon it. The stone platform itself was perhaps 50 paces across, worn smooth by countless generations of weather and ceremony. Einar arrived first with his hill people warriors, their movement across the terrain displaying the silent efficiency that marked their mountain-bred expertise. They arranged themselves with practiced discipline, weapons ready but not openly threatening. Ironbone's army appeared shortly after dawn, 500 warriors whose very presence seemed to alter the atmosphere. They moved with the confident swagger of men who had won victories through superior numbers and aggressive tactics. At their head rode Ironbone himself, and Einar's first sight of his opponent confirmed everything Valdis had said about her brother's physical presence. The man was a giant, even by the standards of northern warriors, standing perhaps a head taller than Einar and possessing shoulders that could have supported roof beams. His famous axe hung at his side like a natural extension of his arm. The formal preliminaries proceeded according to ancient protocol. Victory would belong to whoever remained standing when his opponent could no longer continue, with leadership of all forces passing to the winner. Einar drew his sword Frostbite for the first time in years, the familiar weight settling into his hand like the greeting of an old friend. The blade had been forged by his grandfather's smith from steel that had been folded until it possessed an edge that could split hairs. Ironbone's choice of the massive family axe proved as formidable as reputation suggested. The weapon was clearly designed for a warrior of his exceptional size and strength. "You could have avoided this," Ironbone said, as they took their positions. Your reputation suggested a man who preferred negotiation to violence. I do prefer negotiation, Einar replied. But some negotiations require the backing of strength to be taken seriously. The signal to begin came from the arbiter's raised hand falling to his side, and immediately both warriors began the deadly dance of probing attacks. Ironbone's initial strikes came with measured power, testing his opponent's reflexes while conserving energy. Einar responded with calculated patience. He used his shield to deflect rather than block the axe's massive force, allowing the weapon's momentum to carry it past him while seeking opportunities to close distance. The early exchanges revealed the fundamental difference in their fighting philosophies. Ironbone fought with overwhelming aggression, while Einar employed tactical thinking to exploit his opponent's weaknesses. The combat settled into a pattern that tested both fighters' endurance and skill. Ironbone's superior reach and strength were offset by his weapon's greater weight. Einar's speed and tactical thinking were balanced against the reality that a single mistake could prove instantly fatal. As the morning sun climbed higher, both warriors began to show the effects of sustained combat. It was during one of these moments of mutual fatigue that the first significant exchange occurred. Ironbone committed to a massive overhead blow that would have split Einar from crown to sternum if it had connected, but the very power created an opening. Einar stepped inside his opponent's reach and drove his sword toward the gap beneath Ironbone's raised arm. The blade found its mark, sliding between mail rings to open a wound that drew first blood. The cut was not deep enough to prove decisive, but it served notice that the outcome remained uncertain. First blood to you, Ironbone acknowledged, but the combat is far from finished. The wound seemed to focus rather than weaken Ironbone, and his subsequent attacks came with increased intensity. He had clearly been holding capability in reserve, and now he displayed the full range of skills that had made him legendary among his warriors. Einar found himself hard-pressed to maintain defensive positioning as Ironbone's axework became more sophisticated, combining raw power with tactical thinking that eliminated many previous openings. The larger warrior was learning and adapting, using his experience to counter Einar's advantages. You have skill, Ironbone admitted between exchanges, but skill alone will not save you when strength fails. Their weapons met in a series of impacts that rang across the stone platform like hammer blows on an anvil. Each clash tested not just their physical prowess but their mental resolve as fatigue began to accumulate and small mistakes could prove fatal. Einar's strategy shifted as he recognized that Ironbone's adaptation was neutralizing his initial advantages. Rather than continuing the patient approach that had served him well, he began to press more aggressive attacks, using his sword's speed to create combinations that forced his opponent to react rather than dictate the combat's rhythm. The change in tactics caught Ironbone slightly off guard, and for several crucial exchanges, Einar managed to regain the initiative. His blade found its way past the giant's defenses twice more, opening cuts on his opponent's arm and thigh that were shallow but cumulative in their effect. Yet Ironbone's response demonstrated why he had earned his fearsome reputation. Instead of growing more cautious as the wounds accumulated, he became more reckless, trading his own safety for opportunities to land the single devastating blow that would end the combat decisively. The turning point came when Einar's shield, weakened by repeated impacts from the massive axe, finally split along a stress line that had been invisible until the moment of failure. The oak and iron barrier that had protected him throughout the early stages of combat suddenly became a liability rather than an asset. Ironbone's eyes lit with predatory satisfaction as he recognized the shift in advantage. Now we see what you can accomplish with steel alone, he said, pressing an attack that forced Einar to rely entirely on his sword for both offense and defense. The loss of the shield changed everything. Einar could no longer deflect the axe's massive force, but had to avoid it entirely, requiring greater energy expenditure and more precise timing. His footwork became crucial as he danced around his opponent's reach while seeking openings that were becoming increasingly rare. But the very desperation of his situation unlocked something within Einar that had been dormant since his youth. The tactical mind that had made him a respected leader merged with the warrior instincts that had kept him alive through countless battles, creating a synthesis that transcended either capability alone. He began to fight with the fluid grace of someone who had accepted that survival required perfection. Every movement served multiple purposes: defense flowing into attack, retreat creating opportunities for advance, apparent weakness masking moments of devastating strength. Ironbone found himself facing an opponent who seemed to anticipate his attacks before they were fully formed, whose blade appeared wherever his axe was not, whose very presence on the battlefield had transformed from that of a skilled fighter to something approaching the legendary. "What manner of man are you?" Ironbone gasped, as one of his most powerful attacks was not just avoided but turned into a counterattack that opened another wound across his ribs. "I am a man who has learned that true strength comes not from overwhelming others, but from becoming worthy of their trust," Einar replied, his voice steady despite the tremendous physical demands of the extended combat. The philosophical difference between them had become manifest in their fighting styles. Ironbone sought to impose his will through superior force, while Einar had learned to work with the natural flow of combat to achieve victory through harmony rather than domination. As the sun reached its zenith, both warriors were operating on reserves of endurance that spoke to lifetimes of conditioning and an iron will that refused to accept defeat. Their breathing came in harsh gasps. Their movements had lost some of their earlier precision, but neither showed any sign of yielding. It was then that Einar saw his opportunity, a moment when Ironbone's fatigue caused him to overcommit to an attack that left him temporarily off balance. The giant warrior's axe swept through empty air as Einar stepped inside his reach and drove Frostbite forward with every ounce of strength remaining in his body. The blade found the gap between mail links that Einar had been targeting throughout the combat, sliding deep between ribs to pierce the heart that had beaten with such fierce determination throughout the prolonged duel. Ironbone's eyes widened with surprise rather than pain, his massive frame swaying as his strength fled like water from a broken vessel. Yet even in death, he maintained his dignity, offering a slight nod of respect to the opponent who had bested him through skill rather than luck. "Well fought," he whispered as he fell to his knees, then forward onto the ancient stone that had witnessed countless such moments of triumph and loss. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before Ironbone's army erupted in acknowledgement of their new leader. 500 voices joined with 200 in proclaiming Einar's victory and accepting the authority that victory had transferred to him. But as he stood over his fallen opponent's body, Einar felt no satisfaction in triumph. Instead, he experienced the profound sadness that comes from recognizing that a good man had chosen a destructive path and paid the ultimate price for that choice. 3 months after the trial by combat, spring had returned to the fjords with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the peace that had settled over the northern territories. The snow had melted from all but the highest peaks, revealing landscapes transformed by more than just the changing seasons. Where once scattered settlements had struggled in isolation, a new confederation was taking shape under Einar's leadership. The long hall that had once sheltered only its solitary master now served as the heart of something unprecedented in the region's history. Representatives from the hill people, former members of Ironbone's army, and leaders from the settled communities gathered regularly around the great table where Einar's father had once dispensed justice. The conversations that took place there were shaping a future that honored tradition while embracing necessary change. Valdis had proven instrumental in the transition that followed her brother's death. Her knowledge of his army's structure and the individual loyalties of its various commanders had enabled Einar to integrate the former raiders into his confederation without the bloodshed that many had feared inevitable. Those who could not accept the new order had been given safe passage to seek their fortunes elsewhere, while those who remained had found purpose in protecting rather than predating upon their neighbors. The spring planting goes well across all settlements, Bjorn reported during one of their regular councils. The young hill people leader had adapted quickly to his new role as Einar's lieutenant. His earlier frustration with isolation transformed into enthusiasm for the challenges of building something larger than any of their peoples had previously imagined. "And the trade routes?" Einar asked, reviewing the reports that detailed how their confederation was reshaping the region's economy. The hill people's knowledge of mountain passes had opened new connections between communities that had rarely interacted, while former raiders had proven surprisingly effective as guards for merchant caravans. "Expanding faster than we anticipated," replied Henrik, who had transitioned from tending livestock to coordinating the complex logistics that their growing alliance required. "The merchants appreciate having safe passage guaranteed, and they're willing to pay for the security our patrols provide." The changes were visible everywhere Einar looked. Fields that had been abandoned due to raiding threats were being replanted. New construction was reshaping settlements that had previously focused solely on defense, and most importantly, children were growing up in communities where cooperation had replaced suspicion as the fundamental organizing principle. Yet the most significant transformation was perhaps the most personal. The loneliness that had defined Einar's existence since Astrid's death had been replaced by something he had never expected to find again: family. Not the family of blood, but the family of choice that had formed around their shared commitment to building something worthy of the sacrifices that had made it possible. Asmund and Freda had remained as his closest advisors, their wisdom proving invaluable as they navigated the complex negotiations required to transform former enemies into allies. Their quiet presence in the hall had restored the warmth that had been absent since his wife's passing, while their deep understanding of leadership's burdens had provided counsel that eased the weight of responsibility. "You have given our people something we thought lost forever," Frida observed one evening as they sat before the fire that had witnessed so many crucial conversations. "Hope for a future that honors our past, while embracing possibilities we had forgotten how to imagine." "We built it together," Einar replied, gesturing toward the maps and correspondence that covered the table evidence of a confederation that spanned territories once divided by suspicion and conflict. "No single person could have created something this complex from nothing." The sound of approaching riders drew their attention to the hall's entrance, where messengers continued to arrive with news from across their expanding network of alliances. Tonight's visitors brought word from the sea wolves, whose ships now patrolled the coastal waters, to ensure that the peace they had built on land extended to the maritime approaches as well. As Einar read their report by firelight, he reflected on the simple act of mercy that had set all of these changes in motion. Two elderly strangers freezing in a snowstorm, rescued without thought of reward or recognition, had proved to be the catalyst for transformation that none of them could have anticipated. The storm that had brought Asmund and Frida to his door had indeed changed everything, but not in the way any of them had initially imagined. Instead of the conquest or destruction that had seemed inevitable, it had created space for something new, to grow a confederation based on mutual respect rather than dominance, on protection rather than predation. Outside, the wind carried the sounds of a world at peace with itself, and Einar smiled as he thought about the generations who would inherit what they had built together through courage, wisdom, and the simple recognition that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can reshape the course of history itself.